The divorce papers felt far heavier than ordinary paper should. They rested inside a plain brown envelope on Alessandro De Luca's polished mahogany desk, waiting for a signature that would quietly end 12 years of marriage. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, the skyline shimmered beneath the afternoon sun, while cargo ships bearing the De Luca emblem moved steadily through the harbor below. Thousands of employees trusted his decisions every day. International investors admired his discipline. Rival families respected his leadership because he had transformed what had once been a feared crime syndicate into one of the country's most powerful legitimate business empires. Ports, shipping companies, luxury hotels, private security firms, construction projects, and logistics networks stretched across several nations under his careful guidance. Everyone believed Alessandro De Luca was a man who never hesitated. Only he knew how exhausted he had become. The pen hovered over the final page for several long seconds before he forced himself to sign his name. The ink dried almost immediately, but the ache inside his chest only deepened. Lorenzo Conti, the family's longtime attorney, quietly closed the file without saying much. He had prepared countless contracts, succession documents, trust agreements, and corporate restructurings for the De Luca family over the years. This was the first time he had prepared divorce papers for its chairman. "I'm sorry it came to this," Lorenzo said gently. Alessandro gave a faint nod without looking up. "So am I." Once the lawyer left, silence settled over the enormous office. Alessandro remained seated, staring at the framed photograph resting near his computer. It had been taken on their wedding day. Isabella smiled so brightly in that picture that it almost seemed impossible she could ever become the quiet woman who now barely looked him in the eyes. He reached toward the frame, but stopped before his fingers touched it. Some memories hurt too much to revisit. There had been a time when their home felt alive from sunrise until midnight. Isabella would greet him at the front door after long business trips with warm hugs and endless questions about his travels. They cooked together on quiet evenings despite employing an entire household staff. She laughed whenever he attempted recipes beyond simple pasta, teasing him that billion-dollar negotiations came easier to him than following instructions in a cookbook. Back then, every success felt worth celebrating because they celebrated it together. Somewhere along the way, everything changed. It hadn't happened overnight. It had happened so slowly that Alessandro couldn't identify the exact moment happiness began slipping through their fingers. Nearly a year earlier, Isabella started working longer hours at the De Luca Foundation, the charitable organization she personally directed. She explained that new healthcare initiatives required additional oversight. Alessandro believed her without hesitation. Then weekend visits to her mother became more frequent. Soon they became every weekend. Dinner conversations grew shorter. Sometimes they disappeared completely. Instead of asking about his meetings or sharing stories from her own day, Isabella quietly excused herself after only a few bites, claiming she still had reports to finish. Late at night, he often woke to find her side of the bed empty. Sometimes she sat alone in the library. Other nights she stood quietly on the balcony, overlooking the gardens. Whenever he approached, she smiled politely before saying she would come inside soon. But she rarely did. Their once effortless conversations became careful exchanges filled with ordinary questions. "How was work?" "Busy." "Did you eat?" "Yes." "I'm tired." "So am I." Nothing sounded wrong. Yet nothing sounded right anymore. The silence between them gradually became louder than any argument. Alessandro tried convincing himself it was temporary. Business pressures came and went. Stress affected everyone differently. But as months passed, small details began planting uncomfortable questions inside his mind. She started stepping into another room whenever her phone rang. When he entered unexpectedly, conversations ended almost immediately. He noticed transfers leaving one of her personal investment accounts. Jewelry he remembered her grandmother leaving behind quietly disappeared from the family safe. When he casually asked whether everything was all right financially, Isabella simply smiled. Everything's fine. Those 3 words became the answer to every question. Everything's fine. The more she repeated them, the less Alessandro believed them. Fear has a dangerous way of filling empty spaces with imagined truths. He never found evidence of betrayal. No mysterious messages. No unfamiliar names. No hidden photographs. Nothing concrete. Only distance. Only silence. Only a wife who no longer reached for his hand while watching movies or rested her head against his shoulder during long evenings by the fireplace. He began noticing every delayed reply, every canceled dinner, every late evening at the foundation, every weekend spent at Rosa Romano's countryside estate. His mind slowly built a story his heart desperately hoped was false. Perhaps there was another man. Perhaps she had fallen out of love. Perhaps she remained only because leaving the chairman of the De Luca group carried consequences neither of them wished to face publicly. The possibility haunted him. More painful still was the realization that he no longer had the courage to ask. Several times he stood outside her office, intending to begin an honest conversation. Each time he walked away. She looked so tired, so emotionally distant, as though she carried burdens she refused to share. Eventually, even hope became exhausting. 2 weeks earlier, he had quietly called Lorenzo. The lawyer never questioned his decision. He simply prepared the documents. Now those papers rested inside a plain brown envelope lying on Alessandro's desk. His assistant entered softly. "Sir, your car is ready." Alessandro slipped the envelope beneath his arm before standing. "I'm leaving for the afternoon." The drive toward Rosa's countryside estate stretched across rolling vineyards and quiet hills bathed in fading sunlight. Normally, Alessandro appreciated the peaceful scenery. Today, he barely noticed it. Every mile felt like another goodbye. He remembered bringing Isabella along these same roads during their first year of marriage. She had insisted on stopping at roadside fruit stands, laughing as she filled the back seat with baskets of peaches they never managed to finish. Now he drove alone. His wedding ring felt unusually heavy against the steering wheel. He glanced toward the passenger seat, where the envelope rested silently. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't even certain he wanted answers. He simply believed dignity sometimes meant accepting that love had ended before resentment destroyed whatever respect remained. If Isabella truly no longer loved him, he would not force her to stay. He whispered the words into the quiet cabin, almost as though convincing himself. Sometimes letting go is the last way we protect someone we love. Yet even as he said them, something deep inside refused to believe their story was truly over. Ahead, Rosa's elegant countryside estate slowly appeared beyond rows of ancient olive trees, peaceful and unchanged. Alessandro tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He had come to deliver divorce papers. He had no idea that before this day ended, a single overheard conversation would unravel every painful assumption he had carried for nearly a year. Isabella Romano De Luca had become an expert at pretending everything was normal. Every morning she dressed with the same quiet elegance that had once made magazine editors call her the most graceful woman in the De Luca empire. Every board meeting, every charitable gala, every hospital fundraiser was met with the same composed smile that reassured investors, employees, and council members that the chairman's wife remained as calm and capable as ever. No one noticed how carefully she concealed the slight tremble in her hands after long meetings, or how often she excused herself to regain her breath before returning with that familiar, reassuring smile. The only people who knew the truth were her mother, Rosa, and Dr. Elena Marino, the specialist who had looked into Isabella's frightened eyes nearly 10 months earlier before quietly explaining that an aggressive illness had been discovered. The treatment offered hope, but it demanded immediate action, costly procedures, and months of uncertainty. Isabella had walked out of that hospital carrying a folder of medical reports instead of bringing the devastating news home to her husband. She knew Alessandro better than anyone. If he learned the truth, he would postpone every international expansion, abandon critical negotiations, liquidate company assets if necessary, and spend every waking hour sitting beside her hospital bed. Thousands of employees depended on the De Luca Group, and countless families relied upon the stability of the legitimate empire they had spent years building together. She refused to become the reason it all stopped. Instead, Isabella quietly began sacrificing pieces of her own life without allowing anyone to notice. Jewelry inherited from her grandmother disappeared one piece at a time through discreet private auctions arranged under strict confidentiality. Dividend payments from her personal trusts were redirected toward medical expenses before they ever reached her accounts. She quietly sold minority investments that Alessandro had once encouraged her to keep for the future, smiling whenever financial advisors asked whether she was funding another charitable project. Even the accountants overseeing the family's complex trusts assumed she was simply restructuring her personal portfolio. No one imagined the elegant mafia queen was secretly financing her own fight for survival. To protect the empire further, she accepted additional responsibilities within the De Luca Foundation, using late meetings and endless paperwork as believable excuses for hospital appointments, treatments, and consultations that left her physically exhausted. Every evening she returned home hoping she could hide another day of pain behind a gentle smile, but each lie created another invisible wall between her and the only man she wanted beside her. That weekend, she arrived once again at her mother's quiet countryside estate, carrying a small leather folder instead of flowers. Rosa immediately recognized the exhaustion hidden behind her daughter's calm expression and led her into the sunlit sitting room without asking unnecessary questions. After pouring tea neither of them intended to drink, Rosa finally spoke with heartbreaking honesty. She told Isabella that love built on silence eventually begins to resemble rejection, no matter how noble the reason for the silence may be. She begged her daughter to tell Alessandro everything before fear permanently replaced trust. Isabella lowered her eyes toward the unopened medical reports resting inside the folder and struggled to steady her voice. "Every time I decide to tell him," she whispered, "I imagine watching him choose between saving me and protecting everything we've built. I can't ask him to lose both." Outside, the afternoon breeze gently stirred the olive trees surrounding the estate, carrying with it the quiet sound of approaching tires that neither woman noticed. Alessandro had just arrived, still believing he carried the final chapter of their marriage inside a simple brown envelope. Alessandro turned off the engine but remained motionless behind the steering wheel, his hands still gripping it long after the silence settled around him. Rosa Romano's countryside estate looked exactly as it always had, peaceful beneath the golden afternoon sun, surrounded by ancient olive trees and carefully tended gardens that Isabella loved since childhood. It felt impossible that the place holding so many happy memories had become the destination where he intended to end his marriage. The brown envelope resting on the passenger seat seemed to demand action, yet every time he reached for it, another memory surfaced uninvited. He remembered Isabella laughing as she chased butterflies through these gardens during their first summer together. He remembered promising her that no matter how powerful the De Luca empire became, this house would always remain a refuge where titles, wealth, and responsibilities stayed outside the gate. Somewhere along the years, they had forgotten that promise. Taking one slow breath, Alessandro picked up the envelope and walked toward the front door, convinced he was about to close the most important chapter of his life with as much dignity as he could still gather. His hand stopped only inches from the brass door knocker when an unfamiliar sound reached him. It wasn't anger. It wasn't an argument. It was crying. Not quiet tears, but the kind of heartbreaking sobs someone releases only after carrying unbearable pain for far too long. Alessandro froze instantly. The voice belonged to Isabella. During the past year she had smiled through every difficult dinner, every distant conversation, and every sleepless night without allowing him to see a single tear. Yet now her grief poured through the slightly open sitting room window with such raw honesty that it rooted him to the stone porch. Instinct told him to knock immediately, But something far stronger kept him still. Every instinct he had trusted during the past year suddenly felt unreliable. Inside, Rosa spoke first, her voice trembling with equal sorrow. "You cannot keep doing this to yourself, Isabella. You're becoming weaker every week, and he deserves to know before it's too late." Alessandro's heartbeat stumbled. Too late. His fingers tightened around the envelope until the edges bent beneath his grip. Isabella answered after a long silence, her voice barely rising above a whisper. "If he finds out now, he'll stop everything. He'll cancel the Singapore port agreement, postpone the hospital expansion, abandon every negotiation he spent years building. He'll tell everyone the empire can wait." She struggled to breathe between sentences. "But thousands of families depend on those businesses. I won't become the reason their lives fall apart." Alessandro stared at the closed front door as if it had suddenly become unfamiliar. None of her words fit the story he had spent months convincing himself was true. There was no mention of another man, no secret romance, no hidden betrayal. Instead, every sentence sounded like someone desperately trying to protect him from something he couldn't yet understand. Rosa's chair scraped softly across the wooden floor before she spoke again. "And what about your marriage? Do you think watching him believe you've stopped loving him is protecting him?" For several agonizing seconds there was only silence. Then Isabella answered with a broken voice Alessandro had never heard before. "Every morning I watch the man I love lose a little more hope because of me. That pain is far worse than anything the doctors have told me." The words struck him harder than any bullet ever could. The brown envelope slipped from his numb fingers and landed soundlessly on the porch. While for the first time in nearly a year, Alessandro realized he might have been fighting an enemy that had never existed. Alessandro could no longer hear the birds singing in the olive trees or the gentle wind moving through the vineyard beyond the estate. Every familiar sound had disappeared beneath the thunder of his own heartbeat. He remained frozen outside the window, unable to move, unable to breathe properly, as the carefully constructed version of reality he had carried for nearly a year crumbled piece by piece. He had spent endless nights convincing himself that Isabella's silence concealed betrayal, that every late evening, every hidden phone call, and every weekend spent away from home pointed toward another man. Yet the truth unfolding only a few feet away was far more devastating than anything his imagination had created. He suddenly understood that he had never once searched for evidence of her suffering. He had only searched for proof that she no longer loved him. Inside the room, Rosa reached across the table and gently held her daughter's trembling hands. "Your latest scans weren't encouraging," she said quietly, struggling to keep her own composure. "Dr. Marino believes delaying the next surgery any longer isn't an option." Isabella lowered her eyes toward the leather folder resting beside her untouched cup of tea. The folder Alessandro had assumed contained work documents now carried the weight of medical reports, treatment schedules, and decisions no woman should ever have been forced to face alone. Tears slipped silently down Isabella's face as she whispered, "I know." Her voice was exhausted, not only from illness, but from months of carrying a burden that had slowly isolated her from the one person she wanted to lean on most. Rosa's expression tightened with both heartbreak and frustration. "Then why are you still pretending everything is normal? Alessandro has crossed oceans to save employees he barely knew. He's risked fortunes to protect strangers. Do you honestly believe he wouldn't fight for you?" Isabella closed her eyes for a moment before answering. "That's exactly why I can't tell him." She took a shaky breath, each word sounding heavier than the last. "If he learns the truth, he won't think like a chairman. He'll think like my husband. He'll sell ships if he has to. He'll cancel expansion projects. He'll dissolve investment funds. He'll walk away from contracts supporting thousands of workers without hesitating for a second. He'll sacrifice the future we've spent years building because he'll believe my life is worth more than everything else." Another tear rolled down her cheek. "I can't let the empire collapse because of me." Outside, Alessandro's vision blurred. He remembered every board meeting where Isabella had encouraged patience during difficult negotiations, every conversation where she insisted the company's employees should always come before profits, every charitable project she personally supervised while asking for no recognition. She had never been protecting herself. She had been protecting everyone around her, even while quietly losing pieces of herself. Then Isabella spoke the words that shattered what remained of his heart. "The illness doesn't frighten me anymore," she whispered. "What terrifies me is seeing the man I love slowly believe I've stopped loving him. Every time he looks at me with confusion instead of peace, I feel like I'm breaking another promise I made on our wedding day." Rosa finally broke down, wrapping her daughter in a trembling embrace. Outside the window, Alessandro stood motionless, tears falling freely as the envelope containing the divorce papers lay forgotten at his feet, suddenly feeling like the cruelest mistake he had ever made. At that moment, he knew he hadn't come to end a marriage. He had come face to face with the greatest sacrifice love had ever hidden from him. For several long moments, Alessandro remained outside the door, unable to trust his own legs. The man who had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without showing a hint of uncertainty now found himself terrified of taking a single step toward the woman he loved. Every harsh thought he had carried over the past year replayed inside his mind like accusations against himself. He remembered wondering whether she had fallen in love with someone else. He remembered the sleepless nights, the silent dinners, the cold assumptions he had never spoken aloud. While he had been building a case for divorce, Isabella had been quietly fighting for her life and protecting the empire they had built together. The realization cut deeper than any enemy ever could. Taking one slow breath, he pushed the front door open. The soft creak echoed through the house, and the conversation inside stopped instantly. Rosa looked up first, her eyes widening with shock. Isabella turned only a second later. The color drained from her face as she saw Alessandro standing in the doorway, the brown envelope lying forgotten near his feet outside. Neither of them spoke. Time itself seemed to pause. Isabella instinctively wiped away her tears, trying one last time to hide the pain that had consumed her for months, but there was no hiding anymore. Alessandro crossed the room slowly, not as the feared chairman of the De Luca group, not as the powerful Mafia boss whose decisions shaped entire industries, but simply as a husband whose heart had finally caught up with the truth. When he reached her, he gently placed both hands on her face. His fingers trembled. "Why?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "Why did you choose to carry all of this alone?" Isabella lowered her eyes, unable to meet his gaze. "Because I know you," she answered through quiet sobs. "You would have burned down everything we've spent years building if it meant giving me one more chance to live. I couldn't watch you sacrifice thousands of innocent families for me." Alessandro shook his head before she could continue. "You don't get to decide that for both of us." Tears streamed down his face without restraint. "You promised I'd never have to fight alone. I made the same promise to you. Somewhere along the way, we both broke it." The room fell silent except for the sound of their uneven breathing. Rosa quietly stood and left the sitting room, gently closing the door behind her, understanding that what happened next belonged only to husband and wife. Alessandro reached into his jacket and slowly removed the divorce papers. Isabella stared at the envelope with quiet resignation. She didn't beg, she didn't defend herself. She simply nodded as though accepting that her silence had finally cost her everything. But instead of handing them to her, Alessandro opened the envelope, removed every signed page, and looked at his own signature one final time. Then, without saying a word, he tore the papers in half. He tore them again and again, until dozens of small pieces drifted onto the wooden floor like faded autumn leaves. Isabella covered her mouth, unable to believe what she was seeing. Alessandro stepped closer and wrapped his arms around her with a desperation neither of them had allowed themselves to show in nearly a year. "No more silence," he whispered against her hair. "No more carrying impossible burdens alone. If we lose together. If we fight together. And if there's even the smallest chance to save you, then every ship, every contract, every board meeting, and every fortune I own can wait." For the first time in months, Isabella stopped pretending to be strong. She collapsed into his embrace, and as they held each other through tears that neither tried to hide anymore, both of them knew the hardest battle of their lives was only beginning. But at last, they would face it side by side. By sunrise the following morning, the De Luca estate no longer felt like a house filled with unanswered questions. It had become the command center for the most personal battle Alessandro had ever faced. For years, he had mastered hostile negotiations, corporate takeovers, and succession disputes without allowing emotion to cloud his judgment. Now every decision was driven by a single purpose, keeping Isabella alive without allowing the empire she had sacrificed so much to protect to collapse around them. Before the breakfast table had even been cleared, Alessandro summoned Lorenzo Conti, Marco Santini, and the senior members of the executive council to the headquarters. He offered no explanation beyond one firm instruction. Effective immediately, we are activating the emergency governance plan. The announcement stunned everyone. The De Luca Group had spent years preparing contingency protocols for financial crises, cyber attacks, and international disruptions, but no one expected the chairman to invoke them voluntarily while the company stood at the height of its success. Inside the boardroom, Alessandro stood before the executives with an expression they had never seen before. There was still authority in his voice, but the cold confidence had been replaced by quiet honesty. He announced that he would temporarily step back from day-to-day operations to attend an urgent family medical matter. Marco would oversee international logistics and shipping. The chief financial officer would assume temporary authority over investment approvals. Lorenzo would supervise governance, trust compliance, and board voting procedures to ensure every decision remained transparent and lawful. Not a single executive questioned him. Years of earned loyalty spoke louder than curiosity. When the meeting ended, Marco followed Alessandro into the hallway. "You've always told us that asking for help isn't weakness," he said softly. "Today you finally believed your own advice." Alessandro managed the faintest smile before placing a grateful hand on his friend's shoulder. Meanwhile, Isabella sat inside Dr. Elena Marino's office as fresh scans illuminated the large screen across the room. The doctor's expression remained calm, but Isabella recognized the concern hidden behind years of professional discipline. The illness had progressed despite months of treatment. Surgery could no longer be delayed. It carried real hope, but it also carried significant risks that neither doctor nor patient could ignore. Before Isabella could respond, the office door opened quietly. Alessandro stepped inside and crossed the room without hesitation. This time there were no secrets waiting outside closed doors. He pulled a chair beside her and gently intertwined his fingers with hers. Looking directly at Dr. Marino, he said, "From today forward, every decision includes both of us." Isabella closed her eyes as tears quietly escaped. For months she had feared this exact moment, believing it would destroy everything they had built. Instead, she discovered she no longer had to carry the weight alone. Later that evening, as the sun disappeared behind the hills surrounding their estate, Alessandro and Isabella walked slowly through the gardens where they had once dreamed about growing old together. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Isabella admitted the fear she had hidden even from herself. "What if I don't survive the surgery?" she whispered. Alessandro stopped walking and gently turned toward her. "Then I will spend the rest of my life honoring every sacrifice you made," he answered. "But I refuse to plan my future around losing you. I plan to grow old with you, argue over trivial things, celebrate anniversaries, and complain about grandchildren making too much noise." For the first time since her diagnosis, Isabella laughed through her tears, yet neither of them noticed the black luxury sedan parked beyond the estate gates. Inside, an unknown man lowered a pair of binoculars and quietly made a phone call. "She's scheduled for surgery," he said. "If the De Luca chairman is distracted now, this may be our only opportunity to move against the empire." The morning of Isabella's surgery arrived beneath a sky so gray that even the sunrise seemed reluctant to appear. Long before dawn, Alessandro stood beside the hospital window watching rain gather on the glass, his tailored suit untouched by the elegance that usually defined him. The chairman who could command boardrooms across continents now found himself powerless in the one place where authority carried no value. Around them, the private medical wing remained unusually quiet. Only the steady rhythm of monitors and distant footsteps reminded him that life continued beyond the fear consuming his heart. Isabella sat on the edge of the hospital bed wearing a simple patient gown, her wedding ring still resting on her finger, because she had quietly insisted it remain there until the last possible moment. She smiled at Alessandro, not because she felt brave, but because she knew he needed something to hold onto before she disappeared behind the operating room doors. Just as a nurse entered to begin the final preparations, Alessandro's phone vibrated relentlessly. Marco Santini's name flashed across the screen again and again. Reluctantly answering, Alessandro expected another routine update about the company. Instead, Marco spoke with unusual urgency. "Chairman, someone has been buying shares through shell companies since yesterday. They're targeting subsidiaries connected to our ports and logistics division. The pattern is coordinated." Someone believes you'll be too distracted to respond. Alessandro closed his eyes for a moment. The timing wasn't accidental. Years of corporate warfare had taught him to recognize an opportunistic attack. Yet before he could answer, Isabella gently touched his arm. "Go," she whispered. "The Empire needs you." Alessandro slowly shook his head. "Not today." He silenced the phone without another word and placed it face down on the bedside table. Looking directly into her eyes, he said, "For years you believed protecting the Empire meant sacrificing yourself. Today the Empire can wait. You can't." The operating team arrived moments later. As the nurses carefully wheeled Isabella toward the surgical suite, she reached for Alessandro's hand one final time before the automatic doors separated them. "Promise me something," she said softly. "If this doesn't end the way we hope, don't let guilt become your prison." Alessandro pressed his forehead gently against hers. "The only promise I'm making is that you'll hear me complain about your terrible taste in old movies for another 40 years. Isabella laughed through trembling tears as the doors slowly closed between them. It was the last sound he heard before silence consumed the corridor. Hours passed with unbearable slowness. Alessandro remained outside the operating theater, refusing every offer of food, coffee, or rest. Rosa prayed quietly with a worn rosary clutched tightly in her hands while Lorenz reviewed legal documents he never actually read. Even Marco eventually arrived at the hospital after delegating emergency authority to the Executive Council. "The board rejected every hostile move," he reported. "Your governance safeguards held. The company is secure." Alessandro nodded politely, but his attention never left the red surgical light above the operating room door. Then the light suddenly switched off. Dr. Elena Marino emerged first, her surgical cap still in place, her face impossible to read. Before anyone could ask a question, two unfamiliar men in dark business suits approached from the opposite end of the corridor and quietly presented identification to hospital security. They weren't police officers, and they weren't doctors. Marco immediately recognized one of the names displayed on the badge, and his expression changed completely. He stepped close to Alessandro and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "They're from the Financial Crimes Authority. They aren't here for Isabella." He looked toward the approaching officials with growing concern. "They're here because someone has accused the De Luca Group of hiding billions through fraudulent trusts." Alessandro glanced from the operating room to the investigators walking steadily toward him, realizing that while his wife had been fighting for her life, another battle had just arrived at the hospital doors. The hospital corridor seemed to shrink around Alessandro as the two investigators stopped only a few feet away. Their dark suits, polished shoes, and expressionless faces belonged to people accustomed to delivering difficult news without emotion. One of them introduced himself as Senior Investigator Daniel Mercer from the Financial Crimes Authority and calmly presented an official authorization. "Mr. De Luca, we need your cooperation regarding allegations involving concealed trust structures, offshore asset transfers, and fraudulent governance records connected to the De Luca Group." The words barely registered. Alessandro's eyes remained fixed on the operating room doors where Isabella was still fighting for her life. He accepted the document without reading it. "My wife is in surgery," he replied quietly. "If this concerns my company, my legal counsel will cooperate fully. Right now, I'm not leaving this corridor." Mercer studied him for a moment before nodding respectfully. "We're not here to arrest anyone. We're here because the complaint contains highly detailed financial information that only someone with extraordinary internal knowledge could have assembled." Lorenzo Conti immediately requested a copy of the complaint and began reviewing the documents with practiced precision. Within minutes, his expression shifted from confidence to genuine confusion. "This doesn't make sense," he murmured. "The account numbers are real. The trust names are real. Even the board resolutions are authentic, but the conclusions are completely fabricated." Someone had taken genuine corporate records and carefully rearranged them into a story that appeared believable to anyone unfamiliar with the DeLuca Group's governance structure. It wasn't simply an attack on the company's reputation. It was an attempt to turn transparency into evidence of corruption. Marco leaned closer and quietly added, "Whoever prepared this knew exactly where to look. They understood our trusts, our subsidiaries, even confidential succession protocols. This wasn't written by an outsider." Before Alessandro could respond, Rosa hurried toward them carrying Isabella's leather medical folder. During the chaos before surgery, it had been left inside the patient's room. As she handed it to Alessandro, several sealed envelopes slipped onto the floor. Lorenz instinctively bent down to collect them. One envelope caught his attention immediately. It bore his own law firm's seal, but had never passed through his office. Across the front, in Isabella's elegant handwriting, were the words, "To be opened only if necessary." Lorenzo looked toward Alessandro, who gave a silent nod. Carefully breaking the seal, he unfolded a thick set of legal documents. As he read the opening page, his breathing noticeably slowed. The room fell silent. Years earlier, without telling anyone, not even her husband, Isabella had established an independent governance review mechanism within the DeLuca Group. Using her own inheritance and voting interests, she had funded continuous forensic audits conducted through an external fiduciary firm completely separate from the company's management. Every major trust transaction, every board resolution, every international transfer had been independently verified and preserved in encrypted legal archives. The purpose was clearly stated in her own words. If anyone ever attempts to accuse this family of financial misconduct, the evidence protecting innocent employees and shareholders must already exist before the accusation is made. Lorenzo slowly lowered the papers, visibly shaken. "She anticipated something like this years ago," he whispered. "She didn't just protect the company. She built a legal shield around every honest person inside it." Marco stared in disbelief. "She never wanted recognition," he said. "She prepared for a war none of us even knew was coming." At that exact moment, investigator Mercer received an urgent call. His expression changed instantly as he listened. After ending the call, he looked directly at Alessandro. "We've just identified the anonymous source behind the complaint," he said gravely. "The evidence wasn't fabricated to destroy your empire alone. It was designed to remove one specific obstacle." Alessandro frowned. "What obstacle?" Mercer met his eyes without hesitation. "Your wife." Someone believed Isabella DeLuca was the only person capable of proving the allegations false, and they filed the complaint on the very day she entered surgery, expecting she would never return to defend the truth. The revelation struck Alessandro with a force that left him momentarily speechless. Someone had not merely targeted the DeLuca Group. They had calculated every detail with chilling precision, waiting until Isabella lay unconscious in an operating room before launching an attack that depended on her silence. It was not a battle over money alone. It was an attempt to erase the one person who quietly understood every trust, every compliance safeguard, and every governance document protecting the empire from corruption. Alessandro slowly turned toward the operating room doors, realizing that while he had spent months believing his wife was drifting away from him, unseen enemies had spent those same months studying her importance far more carefully than he ever had. The painful irony settled heavily on his heart. He had underestimated the woman he loved in exactly the same way his enemies had, except they feared her strength, while he had mistaken it for distance. Investigator Mercer immediately ordered his team to suspend any public action against the DeLuca Group until Isabella's independent records could be verified. Lorenz wasted no time retrieving encrypted archive credentials referenced inside her legal documents. Within an hour, secure files began arriving from an international fiduciary firm that had quietly monitored the company's governance for years. Every accusation collapsed almost as quickly as it had appeared. The alleged offshore diversions were documented charitable reserve transfers approved by regulators. The questioned trusts had undergone annual external audits. Every board resolution carried independent certifications, digital timestamps, and judicial filings. Instead of uncovering fraud, investigators discovered one of the most transparent corporate governance systems they had ever examined. Mercer looked at Alessandro with visible respect. "I've investigated multinational corporations for nearly 20 years," he admitted. "I've never seen someone prepare evidence years in advance to protect innocent employees from false allegations. Your wife wasn't hiding misconduct. She was preventing future injustice." Before anyone could absorb the significance of that discovery, Marco's phone rang. The cybersecurity division had traced the anonymous complaint through layers of encrypted servers to a consulting company secretly controlled by Victor Morty, a disgraced former executive whom Alessandro had removed from the De Luca Group 3 years earlier after uncovering conflicts of interest. Unable to regain influence through lawful means, Victor had spent years assembling fragments of authentic corporate information, waiting for the perfect opportunity to weaponize them. He believed Isabella's illness would permanently silence the only person capable of explaining the true purpose behind the company's complex trust structure. What Victor had never anticipated was Isabella's extraordinary foresight. Her independent legal archives transformed every attempted deception into evidence against him. As authorities prepared emergency warrants, Alessandro remained beside Isabella's recovery room after surgery finally ended. Dr. Elena Marino emerged with tired eyes but a hopeful smile. The operation had been difficult yet successful. The next 48 hours would remain critical, but Isabella had survived the procedure. Relief swept through everyone waiting outside the room, though Alessandro barely noticed anything except the words, "She made it." When he was finally allowed inside, he found Isabella sleeping peacefully beneath soft afternoon light filtering through the hospital window. Machines quietly monitored the fragile beginning of her recovery. He gently took her hand, careful not to disturb the tubes and medical equipment surrounding her. "You saved this family again," he whispered, emotion breaking his voice. "Even while fighting for your own life, you were still protecting mine." Just as silence settled over the room, Lorenzo entered carrying a sealed envelope recently delivered by an international courier. The package contained no return address, only Isabella's full legal name written across the front. Attached was a brief handwritten note that sent a chill through the room. It read, "She protected the empire from one enemy. She never realized there was another much closer to home." Morning sunlight gently filled Isabella's hospital room several days later, replacing the fear that had haunted every corner only a week before. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor had become quieter, almost comforting, while the flowers sent by employees, neighbors, business partners, and complete strangers surrounded the room with reminders that kindness often grows strongest during life's darkest moments. Alessandro had hardly left her side. The billionaire Mafia boss who once measured his days through contracts, board meetings, and international negotiations now considered every smile from Isabella a greater victory than any business success he had ever achieved. Watching her open her eyes each morning felt like receiving a second chance he never believed he deserved. Lorenzo quietly entered carrying the mysterious envelope that had arrived after the surgery. The anonymous note claiming there was another enemy much closer to home had unsettled everyone, but months of careful legal preparation had taught Alessandro one lesson above all others. Fear should never make decisions before evidence does. Together with investigator Mercer, Lorenzo carefully examined every document inside the package. Instead of exposing another conspiracy, they found something entirely unexpected. The sender had included photocopies of confidential board correspondence, hoping to convince Alessandro that one of his closest executives had betrayed him. Yet every page had been altered so subtly that only someone deeply familiar with the company's governance procedures could recognize the inconsistencies. Isabella noticed one mistake almost immediately. Though still weak from surgery, she quietly pointed to a forged authorization code. "This numbering system changed 2 years ago," she said softly. "Anyone using this version copied documents that were already outdated." Mercer smiled for the first time since the investigation began. Within hours, digital forensic specialists confirmed Isabella's observation. The final attempt to divide the De Luca family collapsed, and Victor Morty was later charged with fraud, forgery, obstruction, and multiple financial crimes based on the overwhelming evidence collected through lawful investigations. No revenge was necessary. The truth accomplished what anger never could. Weeks gradually turned into months. Isabella's strength returned little by little through determined rehabilitation, patient doctors, and the unwavering support of those who loved her. Alessandro refused to return to the life they had lived before. Executive responsibilities remained shared among trusted leaders, proving that the empire had become stronger through transparency rather than dependence on one person. Together, Alessandro and Isabella established the Romano de Luca Medical Hope Foundation, using a portion of their personal wealth to help families facing life-threatening illnesses without forcing them to choose between financial survival and medical treatment. The foundation quietly paid hospital bills, funded research grants, and supported employees across every company within the De Luca group. Isabella insisted that every family receiving assistance be treated with dignity and privacy, because she understood how frightening silent suffering could become. Nearly a year after the day Alessandro had driven toward Rosa's countryside estate carrying divorce papers, he returned to the same place holding something entirely different. Standing beneath the ancient olive trees where his life had almost taken the wrong path, he placed a simple wooden frame on a small garden table. Inside it rested the torn pieces of the divorce papers, carefully preserved beneath glass. Isabella looked at him with gentle surprise. He smiled and said, "I kept them because I never want to forget how close I came to losing the greatest blessing of my life, not because you stopped loving me, but because we stopped trusting each other with our fears." Isabella quietly slipped her hand into his. "Then let them remind us of something else," she whispered. "That silence nearly ended our marriage, but one honest conversation gave us another beginning." As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the vineyards, family, close friends, hospital staff, and longtime employees gathered for a small celebration at the estate. There were no extravagant speeches, no displays of power, and no headlines announcing the evening. Alessandro simply stood beside his wife and publicly thanked every doctor, nurse, employee, investigator, attorney, and friend who had chosen integrity over fear. Looking at Isabella, he said, "People believe empires are built with money and protected by power. They're wrong. They survive because ordinary people choose honesty, compassion, and courage when it matters most." Isabella smiled, her eyes brighter than they had been in years, knowing that the greatest victory they had won was never against illness or false accusations. It was against the silence that had almost convinced two people deeply in love to walk away from one another forever. Sometimes the strongest person in a marriage is not the one who carries the heaviest burden alone, but the one who finds the courage to finally share it. And sometimes the greatest second chance begins the moment truth is allowed to speak louder than fear.